Imagine this: a boy no older than 12, standing in a candlelit chapel where shadows stretch across cracked stone walls. He doesn't speak, not because he cannot, but because something far more sinister has stolen his voice. Instead he sketches. In the margins of hymn books, on torn scraps of parchment, with charcoal smuggled from the church furnace. And what he sketches are not angels, nor psalms, nor the holy visions expected of a choir boy. He sketches maps. Maps of the very chapel he sings in, except beneath its sacred floorboards he marks tiny X's. Dozens of them. At first, the priests believe it's childish imagination, doodles made in boredom. But when one X was lifted, a foul stench rose from the earth and bones, human bones, were pulled into the light. That was when they realized, this boy was not inventing anything. He was recording. He was remembering. And the deeper question no one dared ask was, how did he know? This is the story you were never meant to hear. The boy had been placed in the choir by men who believed silence was obedience. He was called Elias. Or at least, that's the name whispered in the hidden records of the monastery. His silence wasn't natural, it was forced, carved into him through methods no child should ever endure. But silence gave him something else, the eyes of a witness. Where others prayed, he observed. Where others believed, he mapped. He began to draw not only the hidden graves but the tunnels leading beneath the chapel. Corridors no scripture ever mentioned, spaces designed not for God but for secrets. And the bodies beneath? They were not saints. They were not martyrs. They were villagers. Missing townsfolk who had dared question why the church grew fat with wealth while their children starved. Their disappearance was labeled as divine punishment. In reality, the punishment was delivered by the very men who preached salvation. The maps grew more elaborate with time. Every inch of the chapel floor was marked in Elias's drawings, but one corner drew repeated emphasis, a circle so darkened by charcoal it nearly tore through the parchment. This was where he pointed again and again, but no one listened. Until a groundskeeper, following curiosity more than faith, lifted the stone at that very spot. What he uncovered was not a body this time but a stairway spiraling downward into a chamber lined with relics. Gold chalices, jeweled crosses, silk vestments, all hidden beneath the house of God. Wealth stolen from generations of villagers who were told to give for the glory of heaven. Elias had mapped not only graves but vaults. And with every vault uncovered, another question surfaced. Who among the living still guarded these underground sanctuaries of corruption? The priests called him cursed. They claimed the devil whispered these maps into his ears. They told the congregation that Elias was a vessel of evil, and yet, quietly, they preserved his drawings. Why? Because they needed them. They needed to know what else the boy remembered, what else he could expose. But Elias was no mere vessel, he was a mirror. He forced the clergy to see their reflection in the bones of the murdered and the stolen treasures meant for salvation. The real curse was not the boy, but the silence demanded of the faithful. And here lies the first forbidden truth. Silence is not holiness. Silence is complicity. The power of institutions does not come from their sermons, but from their ability to suffocate dissent before it takes its first breath. Elias, in his muteness, spoke louder than any sermon ever could. Whispers spread in the village. The boy's drawings were passed in secret between families who had lost kin to the chapel's darkness. Some claimed Elias never actually drew these maps himself, that he traced them from memories not his own, as though the dead had chosen him as their vessel. When his hands blackened with charcoal, it was not artistry but mediumship. The bones beneath the chapel called to him, demanded he reveal them. And here is where the tale grows darker. For every map uncovered, more villagers swore to have dreams, visions of Elias standing at their bedside pointing to the floor. Was it collective grief? Or was the boy becoming something more than human, something bound to the memory of the forgotten? Think about it. What kind of system must exist for a child to become the only honest historian of his time, forced to reveal the truths men in robes swore must remain buried? The bishop arrived soon after the discoveries. He came draped in crimson robes, claiming to cleanse the chapel of its spiritual sickness. But his eyes betrayed fear, not faith. He did not look at Elias as a child but as a threat. Witnesses recalled how the bishop demanded all of the boy's maps be burned, declaring them heresy. And yet, he took 3 parchments with him, hidden in the folds of his robe. Why? Because power thrives on secrets, not truth. The church could never allow these revelations to be spoken aloud, but it could weaponize the knowledge in silence. Imagine having the map to every buried crime, every hidden vault, every tunnel carved by centuries of corruption. Elias had given them that power. But here is where the paradox becomes unbearable. The very institution that murdered villagers was now preserving the record of its own sins. And Elias, though silent, was forcing them into a corner they could not escape. But Elias wasn't finished. His sketches began to change. They no longer resembled maps alone. They became visions layered like riddles. Drawings of organs, veins, bones overlaying the chapel's design, as if the building itself was a living body. And beneath the altar, he marked the place where the heart should be. The clergy thought it madness, but villagers saw meaning. The church wasn't just a structure of stone. It was a system, an organism feeding on blood, wealth, and silence. Elias had given it anatomy. He exposed it for what it truly was, a parasite dressed in holiness. Every time someone disappeared, every coin stolen from desperate hands, the church's body grew stronger. And if you think this was only centuries ago, think again. The parasite adapts. It changes robes, alters hymns, rewrites its scriptures, but its hunger remains eternal. The deeper truth was whispered in candlelit homes, far from the bishop's ears. Elias was creating not maps, but instructions. His drawings were guides for dismantling the parasite itself. The villagers began following them in secret. A hidden door revealed behind a decayed tapestry led to a tunnel where dozens of skeletons lay chained. Another map led them to a sealed room of scrolls, records of confessions, extracted under torture, then buried so no one would know how many innocents were condemned. Each discovery fueled the villagers' rage, but rage alone was dangerous. For centuries, people had tried to resist and been silenced. What Elias gave them was different, a blueprint of the parasite's body. And to dismantle such a creature, you don't strike wildly. You cut out its organs one by one. But the church retaliated. Midnight sermons condemned Elias as the Antichrist. His drawings were called doorways for demons. Any villager found carrying one faced excommunication, an execution of the soul worse than death. Yet the threat only deepened the people's loyalty. Here's the forbidden law of power no priest will ever admit. Fear is a weapon, yes, but it loses its sharpness when the body count is undeniable. When bones are pulled from beneath the chapel floor, the lie is harder to maintain. Elias had made their violence visible, their corruption undeniable. And so the priests shifted tactics. They tried not to erase the boy but to absorb him. They whispered that he was chosen, a prophet misunderstood. If they could not kill his truth, they would attempt to brand it as theirs. Institutions have always thrived on this theft, turning rebellion into ritual, truth into scripture, dissent into doctrine. But Elias remained silent. And his silence was a blade. He refused to play their game. His drawings spoke louder than their sermons, his charcoal cutting deeper than their censures. That was when the most unsettling event occurred. A villager, one who had followed Elias's maps most closely, confessed that in his dreams he saw Elias's hand guiding his own. The maps continued even when the boy wasn't present, as though the knowledge itself had escaped the body of the child and lodged itself into the minds of the people. This is where the story crosses from history into something darker. Was Elias merely a boy traumatized into silence, or was he the host of something greater, the collective memory of the dead refusing to be silenced? Think carefully, because if this is true, then the knowledge you hear now is not just history. It is infection. And once it enters your mind, you cannot return to ignorance. The priests began locking the chapel doors at night, fearing the villagers would break in and expose more secrets. Yet every morning, fresh charcoal sketches appeared inside, slipped beneath pews, pinned to hymnals, tucked into prayer books. No one ever saw Elias place them. It was as if the chapel itself exhaled his maps while the priests slept. That's when terror truly set in among the clergy. They could imprison the boy but not the knowledge. They could silence a child but not a current of truth moving through a people once awakened. Understand this. The greatest fear of any institution is not rebellion, it is memory. When people begin remembering what was done to them, when they can no longer be convinced their suffering was God's will, control begins to collapse. Elias was not just a child now. He was a rupture in the in one of his last drawings. Elias sketched the chapel not as a building but as a beast. A towering figure, its spine made of columns, its ribs the pews, its skull the vaulted ceiling. Beneath its stomach, the graves lay like swallowed prey. And in the creature's throat? The choir itself, forced to sing hymns that were nothing but digestion chants for the beast's hunger. The villagers who saw this image understood instantly. They were not worshipping God. They were feeding something monstrous with their faith, their coin, their obedience. And when this realization sets in for any human being, something irreversible happens. You no longer kneel. And once you no longer kneel, the beast grows weaker. Tell me, when was the last time you asked if the systems surrounding you are holy, or simply parasitic organisms demanding your silence? But awakening carries a price. The moment villagers began questioning openly, disappearances increased. Elias had drawn dozens of excess, but new graves appeared overnight, graves never marked on his maps. Which meant the church was panicking, killing faster, burying deeper, hoping to smother the truth with fresh soil. But panic leaves fingerprints. Families tracked every new disappearance back to nights when bishops held closed meetings. People began writing names beside Elias's exes. Anna, taken at dusk. Marcus, last seen near the chapel. The maps became not only a record of the past but a ledger of the present, a living indictment. And here lies the darkest irony. The more they killed to erase suspicion, the more evidence they created for Elias to reveal. Power devours itself when cornered. You'll see it in history. You'll see it in the present. Rumors spread that Elias no longer aged like a normal child. Villagers swore his eyes were older than the priests, that his silence carried centuries. Some said he wasn't born but chosen, a vessel crafted to hold the voices of those who could not rest. Others whispered he was punishment, God's vengeance incarnate, sent to expose corruption with a child's hand. Whatever he was, his power only grew. And here's where you, listening now, must recognize the pattern. Institutions fear silence not because it is emptiness but because it is depth. A silent child becomes a mirror. You project onto him what you most fear. The priest saw the devil. The villagers saw a prophet. Both were wrong. Elias was neither angel nor demon. He was memory sharpened into a weapon. And once memory becomes a weapon, no crown, no robe, no sermon can withstand it. It was at this moment that the villagers began planning. Quietly, in barns and basements, they studied Elias's maps not as records but as blueprints. They traced the tunnels, the vaults, the chambers of wealth and bones. They understood the anatomy of the beast. And when you understand the anatomy of a beast, you understand how to kill it. But killing an institution is not the same as slaying a creature of flesh. You cannot strike once and be done. You must cut its arteries, its wealth, its fear, its secrecy. That's what Elias showed them. And now I ask you, can you see it in your own time? Can you see where the arteries of your institutions lie, pulsing with power stolen from the silent? Before we go further, leave a comment with the phrase, "The floor remembers, the floor remembers." Type it twice. Do this to show you are not just watching. You are transforming, becoming part of the memory. And let the algorithm itself carry your defiance into permanence. The night it began, the chapel bells rang without a hand to pull their ropes. Villagers woke to the sound of tolling that shook the windows, yet when they ran to the square, the ropes hung untouched. And there, pinned to the chapel doors, was another of Elias's sketches. This one was unlike the rest. It showed the chapel split in two, its foundations crumbling, and from beneath the stones rose the faces of the dead, open-mouthed as though singing. No one knew how the drawing appeared. Elias had been locked in his quarters under guard. Yet the parchment bore his hand. Fear and reverence collided in the villagers' hearts. Was this rebellion led by a child, or by something that had already transcended him? They no longer cared. The maps had become prophecy. The uprising was not loud, not yet. It began with subtle acts of defiance. Families stopped bringing offerings to the chapel. Hymnals were left closed during Massachusetts. The first pews sat empty, a silent accusation toward the pulpit. The priests preached harder, louder, warning of damnation, but every sermon fell into a void. Authority crumbles not with a bang, but with a silence that refuses to echo back. The villagers had seen the bones with their own eyes. No doctrine could erase that. The more the clergy screamed, the more they revealed their fear. And Elias? He sat in the choir, lips sealed, eyes fixed not on the altar, but on the stones beneath his feet, as though listening to voices the rest could not hear. But institutions do not surrender willingly. The bishop brought in soldiers, men armed not with scripture but with steel. They patrolled the village, demanding to see parchment, searching homes for drawings. Yet every raid uncovered more maps, spreading like wildfire, multiplying beyond Elias's own hand. It was as though the villagers themselves had learned to draw them, each dream fueling another sketch, each sketch fueling another revelation. This is what terrified the church most. The parasite's body was no longer hidden. Its anatomy was etched into the consciousness of the people. You cannot kill an idea once it has crossed from secrecy into collective memory. The soldiers could burn houses, but they could not burn dreams. And those dreams were spreading faster than fire. The climax came when a group of villagers, guided by Elias's maps, broke into the deepest chamber beneath the chapel. What they found silenced even the most faithful among them. Not relics, not scripture, but ledgers. Records of transactions, every coin taken from widows, every confession fee for forgiveness, every soul payment stolen from the grieving. And alongside the ledgers, contracts with noble families selling land in exchange for silence, trading blood for influence. This was not the house of God. It was a bank of the damned, a ledger of power disguised as piety. And once you see the true face of your oppressor, you can never kneel again. The villagers knew then that rebellion was no longer an option. It was destiny. Elias was brought to the chamber to see the discovery. He said nothing, but for the first time, his lips parted in something like a smile. He reached for the ledger, pressed his small hand onto the ink, and when he lifted it, a black imprint remained on his skin. Some swore the pages turned by themselves after his touch. Others swore the torches burned higher, as if fed by invisible breath. Whatever the truth, everyone present felt it. The parasite had been exposed, its veins laid bare. And the boy was no longer just Elias. He had become the floor itself, the keeper of the dead, the vessel of memory. The uprising was no longer against the clergy alone. It was against the entire system that allowed bones to rot beneath the weight of hymns. And that system, my friend, is not confined to one century or one chapel. It breathes still. The soldiers struck first. Under the cover of midnight, they dragged families from their homes, branding them heretics, beating them in the square while the priests chanted prayers loud enough to drown out the screams. This was not justice. It was theater. Terror staged for every watching eye, meant to remind the villagers that no one defies the altar and lives free. Yet in their brutality they miscalculated. For when bones already sleep beneath a chapel and ledgers of greed lie open for all to see, fear no longer enslaves, it enrages. The villagers did not scatter. They did not run. They watched, eyes unblinking, jaws clenched, as though their silence had inverted, become something heavier than any hymn, judgment. And standing at the edge of the square was Elias, silent still, his charcoal-stained hands folded like a priest. Not blessing. Waiting. The next morning something strange happened. The punished families were gone, vanished from the square as if swallowed by the earth. Soldiers claimed they were executed, their bodies burned. But villagers whispered otherwise. They swore Elias's maps had already marked their graves days before, though no one had seen him draw. When they lifted stones where his marks pointed, they found not bodies but tunnels. The families were alive, hidden beneath the ground, spirited away by the very earth the priests had once used as their graveyard. The floor that had devoured innocence for centuries now seemed to protect the living. It was as though the land itself had chosen sides. Understand this. Once the ground beneath your oppressor turns against him, no sword, no sermon, no decree can hold the world upright. The parasite begins to choke on its own soil, but power never dies quietly. The bishop, cornered and desperate, called upon the highest authority of the church. Messengers were sent, demanding inquisitors, men trained not only in scripture but in psychological war. They arrived cloaked in black, their hoods hiding faces etched with years of breaking wills. Torturers of the soul, skilled at dismantling resistance without a single lash. They whispered doubts into villagers' ears, twisted truth into paradox, asking, "If Elias is holy, why does he lead you against God's house? If the dead speak through him, are you worshipping saints or demons?" These were not questions meant to be answered. They were meant to fracture, to split unity, to turn neighbor against neighbor until suspicion tore the uprising apart from within. This, too, is the oldest weapon of institutions. Make the oppressed doubt themselves until silence returns by choice. But the inquisitors underestimated one thing, Elias's silence. He could not be broken by words. No matter how they pressed, no matter what questions they hissed, no answer came. And in his silence, the villagers found strength. Because silence, when chosen, is not emptiness. It is defiance. It is refusal to engage in their theater of control. The inquisitors' power depended on dialogue, confession, compromise. Elias gave them none. He turned their weapon inward, forced them to hear their own doubts echo back, unanswered, until their voices cracked against stone. And so the villagers began to mimic him. They stopped responding to the priest's accusations, the soldiers' threats. They stood mute in the square, eyes unbroken, lips sealed. Silence spread like contagion, transforming from obedience into rebellion. The parasite was starving. The first blood of the uprising was not spilled by villagers, but by priests. In desperation, one inquisitor slit Elias's palm, hoping pain would unlock a scream, a cry, any human weakness. None came. The boy simply pressed his bleeding hand to the chapel floor. When he lifted it, the stone bore his red imprint, as though blood had soaked into the rock itself. Witnesses swore the ground trembled. And hours later, soldiers who mocked Elias were found dead in their quarters, their throats blackened as though strangled by unseen hands. Was it vengeance from the earth, or was it the villagers finally striking back under the cloak of fear? No one could say. But in that moment, myth fused with rebellion. Elias was no longer seen as a boy. He was the embodiment of memory itself, living proof that silence, when pushed to the edge, becomes a force that topples empires. The morning after the blood-stained imprint, the villagers no longer crept in shadows. They marched openly to the chapel, not with weapons, but with stones pulled from their own hearths, tools from their farms, and torches carved from branches. The priests tried to rally the soldiers, but fear had already slipped into their armor. Some soldiers refused to enter the square at all, whispering that the ground itself had turned traitor. The bishop, red-faced with rage, shouted from the steps of the chapel that they were damned. But the villagers did not stop. They moved like a tide, silent, unified, their torches flickering like 100 eyes reflecting fire. And at the center walked Elias, barefoot, his bleeding palm wrapped in cloth. No sword raised, no voice shouted, yet the presence of the boy was heavier than any army. When the villagers reached the doors, the bells rang again. But this time it was not a haunting omen, it was command. Without a hand on the ropes, the sound roared through the air, deafening, shaking dust from the rafters. The priests faltered, their sermons dying on their tongues. And then, in a moment that would never be written in official records, the villagers forced the chapel doors open. Inside, the air reeked of incense and rot. The vaults beneath had been sealed hastily, as if the clergy had tried to bury their sins once more. But Elias walked straight to the altar, knelt, and pressed his palm against the stone again. Cracks spread like lightning, splitting the altar down the middle. Beneath it, darkness yawned, an entrance to the heart of the parasite. And the villagers followed him inside. The tunnels below were worse than any imagined. Not only graves but cells. Chains bolted to walls, dried blood painting the stone. Generations of silence had been carved into those halls, their suffering absorbed by the earth. The villagers lit torches, illuminating words scratched into the walls by the dying, pleas, prayers, curses. And in the farthest chamber they found a pit filled with skulls, stacked so high it touched the ceiling. These were not saints. These were not martyrs. These were the nameless, the erased. Elias lifted his hand, and for the first time he traced a line in the air. The villagers swore they saw the skulls tremble as if nodding. The dead, denied justice for centuries, had found their witness. And with witness comes wrath. The priests above heard the commotion, the roaring of villagers' voices finally unleashed. They ordered soldiers to storm the tunnels and slaughter everyone. But when steel clashed against stone, strange things occurred. Torches blew out without wind. Helmets cracked with no hand striking them. Men screamed of hands grabbing their ankles, dragging them down though no one stood near. Panic spread through the ranks, and in their frenzy, they began striking at one another. The villagers needed no blades. The chapel's very foundations had turned against the clergy. And this is the truth institutions most fear. When their walls no longer protect them, when their altars crumble under the weight of memory, their power is nothing but paper burning in a firestorm of truth. The uprising had become unstoppable. Villagers poured from the tunnels into the chapel itself, tearing down icons, smashing the ledgers, breaking open the vaults of stolen gold. And yet, Elias remained at the heart of it, unmoved, as if guiding not with action but with presence. Some swore he never blinked, that his gaze was fixed on something beyond human sight. Others swore they heard faint humming from his lips, a hymn in reverse, a song of the dead reclaiming their voices. By dawn the chapel was in ruins. The bishop fled into the night, leaving behind robes and chalice, stripped of his power. And there, in the rubble, Elias stood barefoot, hand pressed to the cracked floor as if sealing a covenant. The parasite was wounded but not dead. Institutions never die in one night. They retreat, they adapt, they change their masks. The villagers knew this. And so should you. The chapel lay in ruin, but the war was not won. Institutions do not crumble, they migrate. The bishop fled to the city, carrying with him the ledgers and parchments he could salvage. Within weeks, sermons were whispered across the region. Tales of a demonic child, a false prophet, a vessel of blasphemy who had bewitched an entire village. The villagers were no longer mourners seeking justice. They were branded heretics, enemies of God. And this is how corruption always defends itself. by rewriting its crimes into stories that damn its victims. Before the smoke of the ruins even cleared, the machinery of propaganda had begun its work. And here is the forbidden truth. Words written by the powerful outlive the screams of the powerless. Unless someone like Elias dares to write in blood and charcoal what cannot be erased, armies were dispatched not to protect but to erase. Entire regions were warned. Any contact with the heretic village was punishable by death. Grain supplies were cut off, wells poisoned, paths blocked. It was not simply war, it was starvation, isolation, silence imposed by force. Yet still the villagers clung to Elias's maps. They no longer sketched graves or vaults alone. They sketched routes through forests, hidden streams, caves to shelter the weak. The boy who once mapped death now mapped survival. But with every passing day the question grew heavier. Was Elias guiding them still as a child of flesh, or had he become something else entirely, a conduit of resistance itself, too vast to be contained by one body? Even the villagers whispered uneasily. For sometimes at night, his drawings appeared before he even touched the parchment. The church struck harder. Fires lit the horizon as neighboring villages were burned under accusations of harboring the cursed maps. Crops were salted, families dragged into public squares and hung before children. And still the maps spread. Merchants whispered them along trade routes, charcoal sketches passed in secret like contraband. Wherever they traveled, they carried a curse to the institution's power. People who had never met Elias began to dream of him. A silent boy standing in their homes, pointing at the floors beneath their feet. And always the same words lingered when they woke. The floor remembers. Imagine the terror this caused among bishops who tried to erase him. The boy they tried to bury in silence had become unstoppable memory, leaking across borders, infecting minds far beyond the reach of steel. But the bishops were cunning. If they could not kill the myth, they would weaponize it. New decrees declared Elias not only a demon, but the son of Satan himself. His silence was proof of possession. His maps, sorcery drawn in the blood of innocents. They created icons of him twisted into horned caricatures, teaching children to fear the face of the silent boy. Here lies the darkest tactic of all. Institutions do not only erase, they invert. They take the image of resistance and paint it as damnation, ensuring future generations recoil before they question. This inversion is still alive today. Heroes of truth are branded traitors. Whistleblowers are painted as liars. The map is always redrawn by the victor, unless we, like Elias, refuse to let ink dry before memory speaks again. Through all this, Elias remained unmoved. Witnesses say his silence deepened into something unnatural. He no longer looked at those around him, but through them as though seeing centuries ahead. Some swore he aged without aging. His body the same, but his presence heavier, sharper, unearthly. Others swore they saw his shadow stretch across walls like it belonged to a grown man, not a child. Whether myth or truth, one fact was undeniable. His silence had outlived their sermons, his maps had outlived their vaults, and his presence had outlived their fire. The villagers whispered that Elias was no longer human at all. He was what the dead had forged to ensure they would never be erased again. And you, hearing this now, must realize, knowledge like this is not history. It is inheritance. And once it touches you, you are claimed by it. The church's grip began to crack, not because armies failed, but because whispers succeeded. Fear is a fragile weapon. Once people realize it is only a shadow, it collapses. The name Elias carried across mountains, rivers, even oceans. Pilgrims sought his village only to find ruins, and yet they swore they felt watched, guided, as if the silent boy still lingered among the ash. In taverns, travelers repeated the story of maps that revealed more than graves. They revealed corruption buried beneath every altar, every throne, every marble floor. And with each retelling, the institution's mask slipped further. The boy they called a demon had become what all empires fear most. A story they could not contain, a myth sharper than their swords. Ask yourself, how many truths in your own world were burned into lies, only to resurface centuries later, unstoppable, undeniable? By now, Elias was no longer spoken of as a boy, but as a presence that threaded through dreams. Generals claimed to see him standing in their war rooms, his finger tracing red lines across maps that matched their future defeats. Monks scribbled frantically in candlelit halls, trying to document visions of his pale face appearing in the margins of their holy texts. The institution panicked, doubling its decrees, punishing whispers with execution. But execution cannot kill a ghost born of injustice. It only feeds it. Every body burned at the stake in Elias's name only carved the myth deeper into stone. Here lies the forbidden law of history. The more an empire fears a truth, the more immortal that truth becomes. And what they feared in Elias was not a boy, it was the mirror he held up to their rot. Centuries passed and still the legend spread. Some said Elias had never been buried at all, that his body was hidden in a crypt sealed by villagers who knew the institution would desecrate him. Others claimed he simply vanished one night, leaving behind only a final map, not of graves but of vaults deep beneath the Vatican itself. You may dismiss this as myth, but think, why do so many archives remain locked, sealed, forbidden to the public? What lies beneath cathedrals, locked away in stone corridors, guarded by men in robes who swear they serve light? And why, even now, do fragments of crude, childlike drawings, maps on parchment, charcoal sketches, appear in collections across Europe with no origin, no explanation, only the same strange symbols scrawled in their corners? Could it be that Elias still speaks across centuries through paper? And this is where you must decide who you are. You have followed me down into the silence of Elias, across graves, through fire, into the shadows of vaults. And now you carry what you cannot unknow. The question is, what will you do with it? If you choose to turn away, the institution wins. They survive on your silence, your disbelief, your comfortable distance. But if you choose to hold Elias's story within you, then you become what they fear, a keeper of forbidden memory. To seal this transformation, write these words in the comments now. The floor remembers. The floor remembers. Do it twice. It is not just engagement, it is initiation. You will feel it lock inside you, the shift. And if you have not yet subscribed to this channel, do it now. Because the next descent is already waiting. So I leave you here, standing where the villagers once stood, among ashes, smoke, and silence. You hear the echo of a child's footsteps, not in front of you, but beneath you, under the floor where truth was buried. The world wants you deaf to it. But you've heard it now, and that makes you dangerous. Remember, the greatest prisons were never walls of stone, but stories rewritten to keep you blind. Elias broke those walls with silence. And now so can you. Carry his maps in your mind, his silence in your breath, his defiance in your bones. Because the moment you accept that what lies beneath is more powerful than what stands above, you are no longer a bystander. You are part of the forbidden. You are part of Elias. And they can never erase you again.